Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of Rapid Fire. And today I am joined by a special guest. It's Mr. Robey Jenkins, Precinct Omega, he is known as. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right this morning.
Fantastic. So, just like we always do on this show, I'm going to put you through the Rapid Fire Challenge, which is 15 questions. You've got to answer them in as quick a time as you can. And I'll put
Been in training.
It'll give you a placement on our leaderboard. Obviously, the top at the moment is 53 seconds.
Don't stand a chance.
The slowest is 3 minutes and 42, to the point where he no longer appears on the graphic. So
I shouldn't be there. Should be better than that.
Not if you've been in training. And then we've got lots of wonderful things to talk about regarding your hobby life, and particularly Horizon Wars and all the bits and pieces that you've been doing with that. But we will get to that. So, without further ado, if you are ready,
I'm ready.
Yeah, is your voice box ready? You take a little water on board and ready to go?
Yeah, just finished my coffee.
Fantastic. I love that you're going to be caffeinated as well. That's going to be even better. Right. So, your time starts now. How many years have you been in the hobby?
36.
What game systems do you follow?
My Horizon Wars one, Infinity, and pretty much everything else that isn't 40k.
What are your current armies?
My largest army is Hacker's Lamb for Infinity.
What was your first ever miniature?
A cleric from a manufacturer I was never able to identify.
What was your first ever army?
Ultramarines.
What was the first model? Sorry, what model or unit have you enjoyed painting the most?
IMF Bulldog from Reaper Miniatures.
And the least?
I wrote this down. It's a Scorn Cataphract Arcuari. I hated it.
What was the last model you completed?
Primaris Reaver.
How much hobby time do you get per week?
Somewhere between 0 and 14 hours, depending on where I am in the development cycle.
What is the current model you're working on?
I have like dozens behind me. I'll show you later.
What is the single favourite thing about the hobby?
My patrons.
Your least favourite thing about the hobby?
People who vape at the table.
Who or what got you into the hobby?
Dungeons and Dragons.
What keeps you in the hobby?
The need to make a living and not go back to my old job.
What is your one hobby target for this year?
To make a profit.
Okay, that's it. That's the 15 questions done.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to write this down so I can update the leaderboard. It's a pretty good time. It's not top, but it's 1 minute and 15 seconds. Which
I'm pleased with that. Happy with that.
Yeah, which puts you around 5th, 6th. I think it doesn't put you too far down the leaderboard. So
I just tell myself that if you're going to be quick in that, you've also got to be very, very straightforward in your hobby. And my hobby is anything but straightforward. So I don't like to say I'm more interesting than faster performances, because I'm sure I'm not. But I have a much more diverse experience of the hobby than most people.
Yeah, and I think that is something we're obviously going to come on to. But there's one thing I want to touch on before we do continue. You said your biggest pet hate is people who vape at the gaming table. I don't think I've ever had anyone say that. Well, no, I mean, I don't vape, I don't smoke. But what about that gets you?
Well, do you know, it's weird, because on the one hand, I'm an ex-smoker, and I'm very, very glad that I am an ex-smoker. But I understand where the smoking habit comes from, and I'm sympathetic. And I like that people are moving into vaping. It's generally better for you, I think. But I don't know, there's something about vaping. People think that vaping is just water vapor and it's harmless. But when I'm at the table with somebody who's vaping, it really sits in my throat. And our hobby is very social. There's lots of chat and conversation in it. And when I'm playing across from somebody who's vaping, I find my mouth just gets drier and drier and my throat gets more and more sore. And I don't want to say, look, can you just not do that at the table? Because, as I say, I'm sympathetic and I understand. But on the other hand, a big cloud of bubblegum flavoured fog is just not my thing.
Once upon a time, you go past like a gang of like bikers, for example. They'd be stood there smoking. They all look well-hard. But now you go past them and they're vaping and they all smell like cherry pie. It's not quite the same like physical intimidation, is it? It's very different. Yeah. So expand on you getting into the hobby then. When you first saw a miniature and thought, oh, I want more of that.
Well, it's my big brother's fault. And that's funny because my big brother is definitively not a geek. He is absolutely the epitome of the British version of the jock. He is a sportsman. He's a tough, good-looking guy who, even now in his 50s, is running triathlons in Australia. So, that's his thing. But he was at boarding school in the 1980s, and Dungeons and Dragons was getting to be a thing. And my family and I went away on holiday to South Wales, and it absolutely threw it down. And we were absolutely stuck for anything to do. We hadn't brought any board games. We'd read all of our books. And my brother said to my dad, why don't we give this Dungeons and Dragons thing a try? I played it at school. It's quite fun. And my dad went, yep, there you go. There's 20 quid, which in the 80s was a lot of money. There's a shop up the road which I think sells it. Take your brother and let's go and have a look. And with that 20 quid, we bought the Player's Handbook. This was the Dungeons and Dragons second edition. So it was the first advanced Dungeons and Dragons. He bought the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and 4 miniatures. And one of those was this cleric miniature that became my first mini. And I had it for years, and I lost it in a house move not that long ago. And I've not been able to find it in any catalogue or record of miniatures. I was convinced for ages that it was a Citadel Mini, but it doesn't exist in any of their historical records. And it looks a bit like a Canadian native shaman, in that he's got a big fur hat and 2 big horns, like buffalo horns, and he's got a stone axe or a sort of stone-headed mace, being a cleric. And I have no idea where the mini came from, but that was my first mini, and that was my first exposure to miniatures games and dice-based games. And it has to be said that we tried an adventure. It filled a wet afternoon, and then that was about it. And those books kind of disappeared, and it was probably another 2 or 3 years before I kind of pulled them off my brother's bookshelf and went, oh, what's this? And re-engaged with the game.
Yeah.
So that was probably about 82 when he bought the book, and I was about 7. So it was probably 84, 85 when I started getting into games. And I didn't spend long on D&D. It has to be said, it was far too complicated for me at that age. But somebody at school brought to school the first edition of Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader and a couple of issues of White Dwarf. I think it was around issue 98, 99, and that was it. I was absolutely hooked.
So then you get to a point where you've obviously said in the opening 15 questions, anything that's not 40k. So you've gone from somewhere in 1985 of, Rogue Trader sort of thing with the 40k universe, coming into your life. Fast forward to 2021, where 40k, you've obviously painted it, but you don't play it necessarily.
Exactly. I got no hate. I hasten to add, no hate for 40k at all. But the fact is, everybody plays 40k. There is nothing, for me now as a designer and a developer, there is nothing to be learned from playing 40k. 40k is not exploring any interesting space in the design world of miniature games. It's very much treading the familiar path in pretty much everything they do. There is almost nothing innovative or imaginative in the design of 40k. Now, in the setting of 40k, love it. I mean, I adore the 40k setting. Miniatures design that Games Workshop is coming up with, fantastic. Just, every new kit blows me away, and I'd love to own everything. But my interest as a designer is on what's new, what's interesting, what are interesting ways to explore what we can do with miniatures and tabletop gaming, and 40k ain't that. Now, I've got to say, Age of Sigmar and Warcry and Warhammer Quest, different. That they are exploring new grounds. I'm not saying that Games Workshop's got nothing new to say and nothing to share, but 40k, no.
Yeah, Sigmar seems to be doing this thing where they're actually progressing the story. So in the 20 or so years that I've been in the hobby, and I've been following Warhammer 40,000, how far has the story actually progressed? We've got a couple of Primarchs that have come forward. We've had a couple of like big campaigns and stuff like that, but there's been nothing that's shattering in the way that they have done in the last, what is it, 5 years or so since Sigmar came out. They're now about to drop version 3, I think, essentially, where it's just they're killing characters. They're moving the story forward. So Games Workshop can do it.
And it all shows. I mean, Games Workshop in the late 90s and early 21st century was really struggling. Now, that's not to say they weren't still the biggest elephant in the room. They were. They absolutely were. But that they were stuck in a business model that wasn't evolving, whereas much smaller companies like Privateer Press, Corvus Belli, at the time Hawk War Games, although that's fallen by the wayside now, that they were exploring a new approach to the development of miniatures games that Games Workshop had absolutely ignored, which was this idea of a developing setting, an evolving environment for where you place your game. And there was a change of leadership at Games Workshop. There were a lot of changes in the creative side of things, and Games Workshop learned from these small. I've often referred to the smaller part of the war games industry competing with Games Workshop as their unpaid R&D department, because they're out there exploring the possible, and Games Workshop sees what they do that succeeds and then steals it and rebuilds it back into their games.
Yeah, it's pretty clever. And I go back to the point where you said about obviously late 90s, early 2000s, where Games Workshop was at. And I remember a friend of mine used to work for Games Workshop around that time, around 2003, 4, 5 sort of time. And he basically said that there was probably a time where if it wasn't for the Lord of the Rings miniatures game coming into Games Workshop, they may or may not still exist today. Because of it brought fresh people through the door, because of the Lord of the Rings films were massive, and they obviously then did the thing where I'm going to buy some Lord of the Rings miniatures. Oh, but what's that? And then they got into the fantasy battle, or they got into the 40k, or all three.
I don't think there was ever a risk of Games Workshop ceasing to exist. You know, I think it's easy to overstate the impact that the rise of people like Privateer Press and Corvus Belli have had. You know, even at their height, Corvus Belli was never more than 5% of the size and scope of Games Workshop in terms of its size and its output. But there was definitely a risk that Games Workshop was going to cease to be the industry dominating monolith that they still are.
Yeah, and I think that's possibly more what he was, I suppose, getting at, in terms of it wouldn't exist in the way that it does today, in terms of it having stores in every town, if not multiple. A big Warhammer world and a huge worldwide fan base. It was always going to have something like that, because, you know, at the very crux of it, they could go back to what they used to do and make counters for other things. Like, they have got such a production factory that was never going to happen. But, you know, things like Lord of the Rings helped, I suppose, save the 40k game. It helps, you know.
Yeah, I would say the Lord of the Rings game, in some ways, I wouldn't say they necessarily saved it, but it postponed the decline long enough for there to be a shift in the creative leadership at Games Workshop.
Yeah.
Because what really changed and saved Games Workshop was they stopped telling the community what to want and started listening to what the community wanted. And, you know, the shift to Primaris Space Marines on the back of years of hobbyists and converters making true scale Space Marines to wild acclaim. The reintroduction of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Gene Stealer cults, return to the Adeptus Auroritas, the shift into more and more complex plastic designs and the Night Titans. All of that was driven by community demand. And that demand wasn't fresh. That demand had been going on for decades. But Games Workshop had been going, no, more Space Marines, more Orcs, more Eldar, more of what we've always given you. Shut up and just take what we give you. and the community's response was increasingly, well, screw you, I'm going to play something else then. And finally, there was a change of leadership, and the new creative leadership at Games Workshop realized that they had to change, and that's what saved the company. I think Lord of the Rings at best bought them time.
Yeah, and that's testament to, you know, games like Blood Bowl being because was it, I forget what it's called, Guild Ball or something like that, that came out and basically said, you see all those armies over there, come over here,
Yeah.
and they're starting to do it now, because with all of the Warhammer Fantasy Old Worlds that obviously they killed off for Sigmar, and Sigmar's been a great success for them, but Mantic Games and Kings and their Kings of War went, oh, you see all those Bretonians, you can use them over here, you can use them in our game. And you see this rule book, it's got everything you need. So you don't need to buy 15 books to play our game. And now, obviously, at some point, they're looking to bring the old world back into being a supported game. I don't think we'll get many new models for it, but being a supported format. So, yeah, there is that element of listening to and everyone hopes for Battlefleet Gothica to come back as well, obviously, because that's, you know, a good fun game. Probably not epic. I think I think even my painting skills would be too much for. I don't think.
No. People think that, oh, it's so tiny, I can't possibly paint it. It's incredibly easy painting 6mm minis. They're so easy, so quick, so fun, because they don't have to be painted the way that you paint a 28mm miniature. It's a
less edge highlighting, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, well, generally much less, because you're talking about it's just a different way of playing.
Yeah.
You know, because my first proper professional release was a 6mm game. But, you know, I mean, I can just 2 secs. Just about reach this without running off. You know, here is a mini I painted for a 6mm game.
That's not 6mm.
That's a big. But well, actually, as it happens, this is from a Sheffield-based company called War Games Emporium. I think this miniature was actually designed for 15mm. But, you know, if you want a big stompy mech walker, who's to say what scale this is? I use this in 28mm. I use it in 15mm. I use it for 6mm. I painted it for 6mm.
Yeah.
But, you know, it doesn't have to be teeny weeny, and the infantry, they're incredibly easy to paint. So I would love to see Epic come back. Although with Adeptus Titanicus, of course, they've raised the scale again. They couldn't possibly do it in the original scale and let people use their old miniatures. So they're all now sort of 8mm scale or something like that.
Yeah. If they were to do it, it would be slightly scaled up. And I almost feel like the Apocalypse rules for 40k are almost a tester of how an Epic game could work in the current format, I guess.
Well, I think, I mean, have you ever played the old Epic game?
No, I never did get to play it. It kind of started going defunct around the time that I was getting into the hobby, didn't it? Really?
Well, the original, the follow-up to Adeptus Titanicus, that was just called Space Marine, which was when they expanded into infantry and vehicles as well as Titans, was my first proper tabletop game experience. Even though I bought Rogue Trader and I had miniatures, I'd never actually played the game because it was a very narrative-focused game, and I wasn't quite mature enough to really grasp it. But Space Marine was a game in a box. I could get my head around that. And that was a good game, not a great game, but it was a good game. But it's a very, very tactical experience, much more so than 40k even is today. Yeah. And the follow-ups that followed it, I mean, Epic Armageddon was probably the best designed game that Games Workshop has ever made. That's arguable, but in terms of being a cerebral tactical challenge that also looked fantastic on the tabletop, it's probably the best game they've ever written.
Yeah. So in terms of then being tactical, we're going to bring this into your current project. So you once wrote on Facebook that if you could sell 200 of your game, you'd quit your day job.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you no longer have that day job.
I no longer have that day job.
And you have designed a game that you sent me over the manuals, and I've had as quick a read as I could in the hour.
Sent it to you about an hour ago. I'm really sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. And the one thing that jumped out about it is that it appears so much more of a tactical-minded game than obviously like 40k, but in terms of even their scaled down, like their Kill Team, for example, which was meant to be a bit more of a skirmish tactical version. Yours comes across, just from reading it, just from skimming through the whole the thing, that it comes across more tactical. Talk to us about Horizon Wars. Talk to us about how it came about. And
let me give you a little bit of context. It's important to get this, because first, people do get confused, and I apologize for the confusion, but it is inevitable. There was a game called Horizon Wars that I wrote back in around 2013, 2014. It was published in 2016 by Osprey Games, and it's a 6 mil, brought loosely a 6 mil sci-fi battle game. Osprey and I have amicably gone our separate ways, and so I've set up my own company to publish new games. So I've taken the Horizon Wars setting, and I'm now turning that into a family of related games in what I call the Horizon Wars trilogy. And the first volume in the Horizon Wars trilogy I published right at the start of lockdown last year, which was Horizon Wars Zero Dark. So I will generally refer to it as Zero Dark. It's part of the family of Horizon Wars. There will be 3 games in the family. Eventually there are 1 now, 2 by the end of the week that I'm talking to you. And then in a couple of years' time, the 3rd one will be out. So Zero Dark is a hard sci-fi skirmish game. So that's the first way in which it stands against other games in its genre, is it is hard sci-fi. There are no aliens. There is no technology that is not at least conceivable within our existing understanding of how technology works.
Yep.
It is set on Earth after an apocalyptic asteroid strike, when the colonies from Mars and Venus send rescue missions back to Earth to try and assist, only to discover that the vast majority of Earth's population is missing. And as a result, they are set on 2 paths. The first is in competition to claim the technology left behind on Earth. Because Earth doesn't have to fight to survive the way they do on Mars and Venus, they're much freer to develop new and advanced and innovative technology. And so there's huge amounts for them to learn and basically steal from Earth if they can get to it first. That's number 1. Number 2 is, where's everybody gone? And that's the sort of the main storyline of Zero Dark. So the game is very informed. I haven't mentioned this to this point. I am ex-military. I spent 7 years in the British Army as a commissioned officer. So I went to Sandhurst, and I led a troop. I was not, I hasten to add, in any way an elite soldier whatsoever. In fact, I was a highly inadequate performer. And I was not even in a combat arm. I was a member of the Royal Army Medical Corps. But I at least did have the insight of both the training that I received tactically and strategically, and that I learned from coexisting with my colleagues in more combat orientated forces. And I have always been frustrated that whilst you do get a reasonable representation of modern tactical warfare in modern games, a really good example being Force on Force from Ambush Alley, which is a very good modern sort of platoon level tactical game. But in sci-fi games, people tended to throw all that out the window and just make stuff up. And I didn't think that was right, because I thought actually ultra-modern tactics have a lot to inform in science fiction games. And we see that in console and PC games. You watch, a Call of Duty Modern Warfare or Destiny or any of these team-based, even Team Fortress games like that. Your team, your squad you put together, particularly if you're playing in a team versus team scenario, you've got to use modern tactics. You've got to use an approach that draws upon the experience of the modern military, but which accommodates the new abilities and technology that are made available to you in the setting that you're playing in. And I didn't see any sci-fi tabletop games that were really doing that. Infinity made a really good effort They made a really good try, and then they fell prey to what I call the tournament trap, because the game became very popular on the tournament scene. Great scene, I hasten to add. I love Infinity and I love the tournament scene, but making it into a tournament-focused game meant that there were so many edge cases that were being exploited that bore nothing to do with the tactical experience of soldiers on the ground, and had everything to do with how do I exploit a set of rules to get an advantage in this game. And I was very keen to try and get away from that idea. Now, I've got to say, for the Corvus Belli guys, their 4th edition looks like a really good pushback against that. They've dealt well with a lot of those problems, and I think it's going to be still a good tournament game, but I think it's going to recapture more of that tactical sense that it had in its sort of 2nd and 3rd editions that it lost in the tournament scene. So Zero Dark is my attempt to get back into that. The other things which I always found frustrating, which I also find frustrating about Infinity, is that it tells you how good your soldiers are. You know, in 40k, you pick one tactical marine or another tactical marine or an intercessor or another intercessor. They're interchangeable. They're identical. One is exactly the same as another. A Hak Islam Ghulam next to another Hak Islam Ghulam, same flipping soldier. Doesn't really matter. And that frustrated me as somebody who had been in the armed forces, because I knew that wasn't true. You know, 2 different soldiers may have the same equipment, the same training, the same background, the same cat badge, and yet their performance can be radically different under different circumstances. And as an officer, I knew it was my responsibility to try and maximize the right use of the right soldier in the right circumstance. And I didn't see any of that in tabletop gaming. So it was one of the reasons that all of my games are not just miniatures agnostic, but they're customizable. So the player gets to choose where to put a pool of points into the stats of their characters, units, whatever game you're playing, to create the characters that you want to use, that then forces you to use them in ways that optimize their abilities, which taps back into my experience in the armed forces. There we go. That was a very long monologue. Did that answer your question?
I think you catch on a good point, because, you know, obviously there's 2 things. Obviously, a lot of people, like you say, fall into the trap of it's humans. The humans versus humans game is not going to be interesting. We have to have humans versus aliens versus something else versus other races. You know, that doesn't always have to be the case. And obviously, secondly, like any good, if you ever watch an army film or even a sci-fi film where they've got squads, you've always got, like, you know, you've got a demolitions guy, you've got a guy who's good with tech, you've got a guy who is perhaps going to be, well, he's going to run in and go forward because he's got no regard for his life, but he always ends up being the hero. Like, a squad is. Have you
seen the new Army of the Dead movie yet?
I have not. It's on Netflix, isn't it?
It is.
I've not seen it yet. No. Is it good?
I've watched about half of it. I mean, it's not fabulous cinema, but in terms of being a fantastic scenario for a game of Zero Dark, it is absolutely on the money.
Well, I'll know what I'll be doing this afternoon now. But yeah, so, you know, all these squads, like you say, they're built up of people having different mindsets. Like you say, they might have the same gear because that's what they're given, or that's, you know, you're this kind of squad, so your standard, you know, equipment is this, but you're going to have, each guys are going to have a special thing. I don't work for the military, I'm a civil servant in other areas, but I know how a team is built up of different characters, and you need that to get the job done throughout any given day, or, you know, whatever you're trying to achieve. You know, you're going to have the person who perhaps is a bit more upfront and a bit more is going to sound somebody out, but you've also got the people who are going to play things a little bit smarter. You're going to be people who, like, actually, if we try to do this, you know, do things this way, it's going to be so. To be able to bring that to a game where, like you say, a tactical squad has got, you know, 4 of the same and one guy who's slightly buffed because he's in charge. Like, I completely understand where you're coming from in terms of wanting.
You know, I have a lot of respect. I have a lot of respect for all of the NCOs and sergeants that I worked for. They're all, without exception, better soldiers than I ever was. But I never saw one who thought that a sword and a pistol and no helmet was a good substitute for their rifle.
Oh, that standard Games Workshop plot problem. Like, the moment you get any sort of promotion, it's like, oh, I don't need this anymore. I'm just going to put that over there. and I'm going to stop taking this big gun. I'm just going to have this little one instead. But
Yeah.
no, I get what you mean with that. So I've obviously seen the book. The artwork in it absolutely blew my mind. I like there's the picture, and there's all these dudes all over it, and there's I just looked at it. I thought that is a hell of a picture. That
Now I'm going to need to ask you which picture you were looking at, because the original Zero Dark.
Yes, it was the original. So it was the original rule book, and it was only a couple of pages in, or a few pages.
The front cover.
It's like an A4, just absolutely beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
That is the work of David Sondered of Studio Coloriphobia. I've known David a long time, and he's done a few pieces for me. But he is my #1 go-to cover artist, and he's done the cover art for Zero Dark, for Operation Nemesis, which is the supplement to Zero Dark, and for my new book Infinite Dark. And he's just wonderful. He gets better every single time. I thoroughly recommend his Instagram account to anybody who loves. He does loads of 40k fan art. So I mean, if you're into 40k, he's just such an exciting and interesting artist.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that. But one of the first things I also noticed in the first few pages of the rule book is something that it caught my eye, and I thought, that is an interesting mechanic. So in the what you'll need to play section, you need some D12s, you need some miniatures, some counters, and a deck of just standard playing cards.
Yeah, with 2 jokers.
So
yeah.
So how did you think to yourself, right? I can, because that's different. I've never heard of that in any sort of other miniature thing. How did that come about? I'm going to use the standard thing of the dice, the counters, and all that stuff, and I'm going to have this randomizer, this deck of cards which are going to do different things.
First thing I have to say is, have you ever played Malifaux?
No.
I recommend it. Playing cards, and I've said for a long time, playing cards are one of the most underused, most interesting randomizers that we could have, because there are so many different things that it can do. You've got 4 suits, you've got 13 numbers, you've got number cards and face cards, you can build in jokers, you've got red cards and black cards. You can either work your way through a deck, so every time you flip a card, you're changing the odds of what the next card is, or you can keep shuffling a deck, so the odds are always the same. And you can mix that up. So there are so many different, really interesting things that can be done with playing cards that have been so underused by mainstream games. And Malifaux's the only game that has really thrown itself into it. Now, that said, I mean, I have played Malifaux a fair amount, and my sort of conclusion was that to some extent, because it leans so heavily on the card deck, Malifaux has occasionally run the risk of becoming a card game with a miniatures mechanic rather than vice versa. But that said, I haven't played their 3rd edition very much, so I would point people back to that and say check that out. But I thoroughly recommend people try it and see what they think. In my games, in Zero Dark, there's no card deck in Horizon Wars to start off with. It wasn't something which I used. It's a much simpler game. In Zero Dark, the card deck is primarily there to control the Red Force. And the Red Force is there whether you're playing solo or whether you're playing versus. The Red Force is an uncontrollable enemy force whose actions are dictated by the flip of a card. And the number on the card tells you which enemy is going to activate. The suit of the card tells you what they're going to do. And there are ways that the player can use various abilities, skills, and options to manipulate the deck so that they can influence what the enemy force is going to do. And in the solo game, it's quite straightforward, because you as an individual, you activate a hero, and then you flip a card and you do whatever the Red Force is supposed to do. It becomes much more interesting in the versus game. And because we've been in lockdown for a year, hardly anybody has played the versus game. And I'm really looking forward to getting out there and showing, yes, but you can also play at PvP.
Yeah.
Because so many people are loving the solo experience, but I'm going, yes, but you can also play it against other people, and you still have a Red Force. And again, this represents that kind of feeding back my own tactical experience, that in real life, you don't have 2 equal forces that meet each other and try to win. That doesn't happen. If equal forces meet, they either walk away or they hold in place until one of them gets reinforcements and then attacks the other one. You don't take on an equal enemy. But when you introduce the red force, all of a sudden it adds a narrative aspect to the versus game, that you go, they're both here for the same thing and they've got the same obstacle, but they're also facing the other side. So it's effectively, even in a 2-player game, you've got 3 players. You've got you, your opponent, and the red force. And then every time one of you activates a hero, the red force activates. And at that point, you're then trying to manipulate the deck and the red force to make sure that when they activate, they're attacking your opponent and not attacking you. So again, it just brings in that extra tactical aspect where you're trying to make sure that your opponent is taking the worst of it while you sneak in and grab the objective and get out.
Yeah, like I say, it's not a game that I had heard of, obviously, until you mentioned it, and I've looked at it, and I've now seen the rule set, and as we spoke about off camera just before continuing this, like solo play, is something that I'm relatively interested in. Not because I don't have any friends; it's not that at all. I've got friends. It's just that like during lockdown, for example, we spoke about the Harry Potter miniatures game. That's got a solo version that you can just take on a scenario that's in one of the books or the films, for example. And that can just be like me. I work shifts, so like today it is a Tuesday. Who have I got to play Warhammer against? Nobody. But if I wanted to throw dice, I've got the option of a solo game where I can just set up a board and I can just go for it. So it shouldn't be understated just how useful having a solo version is. And I think the randomizer of the cards, like you say, and you being able to manipulate the deck, so either lessens the punishment on you, or you can direct it towards your opponent in another, like the versus version. It adds a narrative aspect that you can't necessarily plan for as such. Obviously, you know they're there, but you've got limited ideas to what they're going to do. Your opponent is either going to counter what you do, or they're going to play for the mission type, or those sorts of things. Whereas this other red force has got an entirely set of objectives, which is going to be mainly to hurt you or you hurt your opponent. And
the fun bit comes in as well, because I said the deck includes 2 jokers.
Yeah.
And there are various things that may result in a joker, but the obvious one is you flip a joker, and on that occasion you get complications. And complications are a narrative component in the game. So it may just be reinforcements for the red force, which may be red force specialists. It may be that the red force has their mech turn up, their defense mech, to take you on. Or it may be something else. Like if you've already got the objective, guess what? Wrong objective. And you lose the objective, you have to go back and get it again because you picked up the wrong thing. It may set off booby traps or mines, or it may initiate a security system that means everybody suffers the targeted state. Anything along those lines. So it brings in that narrative aspect from the jokers, and they're important to the game. And what I do like to say to people who sometimes people contact me and say, "Oh, I've been playing through these missions and I find them too easy." And to be fair, I've also had people contact me and say, I find them too hard. So I figure I must have the balance about right. But I say, well, if you find it too easy, add more jokers. And it's always great. You get any standard poker deck usually comes with 4 jokers.
Yeah.
So you can either take 2 out, or you can put 2 back in, or put 1 back in. So that really adds to the experience.
So obviously, with people contacting you, which is great, you've got your Patreon, which is also probably going to be very useful for this. Like in terms of like play testing it, how is the process of you take? Obviously, you do an FAQ, you do things like that, but how do you release the game upon the world? Obviously, companies like Games Workshop have got thousands of people they can use all over the world, and they can take that feedback, like you said, take that feedback, and they can apply it however they want.
It is incredibly hard. Zero Dark was my first game. Horizon Wars was basically developed in a vacuum. I was able to take it to the club and to a couple of events and run demos and get some feedback, but there's nothing to compare to just putting it out into the world. And Zero Dark, it wasn't completely developed in a vacuum. I had contacts through Horizon Wars that helped and gave me feedback, but it was almost a solo endeavor My most recent game, Infinite Dark, which is a spaceship combat game based on the same mechanics, has been much more widely play tested thanks to my patrons, which is really good and has definitely made it a better game. But fundamentally, as an independent publisher, you got two choices. Either you keep working the day job and you use every opportunity to play test your game, and you try really hard to persuade people to come and play test with you, which is not easy, because playing an unfinished game is a very different experience to playing a game that people say is finished. Because often you have the designer making up rules on the fly as you go.
Yeah.
You know, if you're playing it with the designer, you go, oh, I want to do this. And the designer goes, oh, I'm not sure what the rules are to do that. I'm not sure I've written any. Right, I'll quickly write some now. Or you'll do it like this. Or you'll do something and the designer go, oh, well, that didn't turn out quite how I wanted it to. Maybe I've got the probabilities wrong on that one. I need to adjust it. So it's quite a frustrating experience playing a game with a designer if you're not ready for it. By far the best way to get constructive feedback on any new game is to publish it. I think yeah,
because
put it out there, publish or be damned. And I can assure you, when people have paid good money for your game, they will tell you what's wrong with it, guaranteed. And the more you charge, the more loudly they will tell you what's wrong with your game.
That is clear from just about any comment section of any game that's being released, or any new models. So the more people want to put money into the hobby, the more they're going to scream about what's good, what's wrong, what's bad, and everything like that.
But where I reassure myself is I go, look, even back when Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader was published, Games Workshop was a functioning company. You know, it may only have had a dozen employees, but it had a dozen employees, which is 11 more than I've got. It's me, in case you're wondering. I'm the employee. And they've been through 9 editions, you know, and the assumption is that each edition is better than the previous one, theoretically. And, you know, Corvus Belli, you know, their first edition of Infinity, it was a complete nightmare. It was practically unplayable. It was almost unreadable. And yet here they are on their 4th edition, and they're a very successful small company with a fantastic game.
And I'll say the same for Night Models. Obviously, I've recently got the Harry Potter and the Batman miniature game made by Night Models. First editions of both, because they're a Spanish company, they didn't use the best translator, and the rules. I remember reading the first edition for the Batman, and I was like, my mind was going, I don't understand this rule set. And you kind of take it to the internet, and then the internet's going, we don't understand the rule set. If you're in an English speaking country, the rule set hasn't been translated well enough. Fast forward, Batman is now on its 3rd and Harry Potter on its 2nd. The edition's so much more streamlined because they've had people playing the game, and they've figured out how to translate the rules better, which is probably a big part of it. But obviously they've listened to a lot of people who are playing it and screaming at it going, this rules mechanic doesn't make sense. We did it like this, we in-housed it like this amongst our friends, and this worked quite well. And they've listened to all of that. Which is quite important.
Night Models have, of course, made other mistakes, but yes, they've definitely improved their game from one edition to another. I will give them that much. The
game is improving. They just need to release their stocks better, but I think that's a worldwide problem in miniatures at the moment, really. They do still make mistakes, but again, relatively, they're a youngish company. They've not been around for decades or anything.
Well, actually, Night Models has been around a surprisingly long time, but they haven't been making games for all that long.
Yeah, it's making their own.
They just made models and mostly sort of display 70mm scale stuff before that.
Which is easy to do because you just take what someone gives you in terms of design. So when it comes to your miniatures, then, because you've not got your own miniatures company
yet.
But,
well, I kind of do, but that's another story.
But so when you are imagining your game being played, what are the best miniatures that you've come across to represent? Because obviously there are miniatures in your books.
There's no best miniature for my games. It really, because because it's miniatures agnostic, although I give a setting, there's no obligation to stick with the setting. You can pick up and transport the game into whatever setting you want to. So, and I've got patrons and supporters who use Star Wars Legion miniatures to play Star Wars scenarios, and they mix and match with their Imperial Assault miniatures to play the game. I've got a lot of people, they like Infinity, obviously, is a good fit, but so are the miniatures from the Human Interface board game, which are now available through the District 9 Patreon. No, Unit 9. The Unit 9 Patreon. They do STLs that you can download and print if you want to try that. Reaper Miniatures have their Chronoscape range, which has got some great sci-fi pieces in it. The IMF Bulldog that I mentioned in the beginning it appears in Operation Nemesis, was an absolute joy to paint. And that's a really good choice. And miniatures games like these are an opportunity to just go out and see what's out there. So there's a company called White Dragon Miniatures, which is a UK-based company. They do some fantastic minis for this game. A friend of mine loves using the Anvil Industry range. They're a bit heroic 28mm for my taste. I like my miniatures to have a more realistic structure, but if you like the heroic look, they do a great range of those. I love bringing in miniatures from other scales. So there's a Polish company called Strato Minis that have actually licensed the original Hard War rules for their own game, Horizon Wars rules for their game Hard War. But they make a 6mm range of miniatures, and they do a 6mm UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, called a Raptor. And I think a Raptor makes a fantastic 28mm drone, and there are drones in Zero Dark. So the drone that I use more than any other is the Strato Minis Raptor UAV. But people also use minis from Warlord Games, Beyond the Gates Vantaris. What other ones have I seen? There's a certain amount of 40k conversions. Necromunda miniatures fit quite well into it. The Spectre, who make modern, ultra-modern minis, they fit quite well into the game as well. Who else have we got? Oh, Bad Squiddo. Annie's range of the Ghosts of Gaia, which are sort of post-apocalyptic sci-fi soldiers. They're really good. Andy Foster's Heresy miniatures, hassle-free minis. If anybody's looked at hassle-free and gone, those are beautiful minis, but what would I use them for? Zero Dark is your excuse to buy.
So there's one miniature that I want to point out that I saw on your Instagram. You repurposed and repainted Thunderbird 2, is it?
Oh yeah. Would you like to see it? It's up here. Hold on.
A phenomenal piece of vision. Because that's usually a very bright and unwieldy green, isn't it? That one, I believe. It
was originally green. Here we go. For the camera.
Look at that.
I'll put the wings down. Put the wings down, and the legs go up. There we go.
And you've repurposed it. It's still there with the Thunderbird 2 written on it, or TB2. But what a great piece of repurposing. I saw that and I immediately fell in love with that. That is phenomenal. Because if you were to buy a mini, like a toy mini of that scale, you would be potentially spending well over £100.
Oh, yeah. I got that off Facebook Marketplace for 15 quid.
So that's the thing. But to buy a child, so even brand new, that would be no more than 50 quid, I wouldn't have thought. So, but what a great piece of repurposing. You see a lot of people take like the kids' castles and stuff, and they add a bit of dry brushing and stuff like that, and they turn them into actual masterpieces, even though they start as this cartoony thing. So I really like it.
There's a piece in the rulebook, in the photography of the rulebook, you'll see a train in the background.
Yes, I did see that one.
That train is a children's toy, and it's now in enormous demand from tabletop wargamers because it's just perfectly scaled for 28mm wargaming. And it's battery powered as well, so you can even have it physically running around the table if you really want to. But that's a beautiful mini. I got it just before interest in it took off, and I managed to snag the whole set for 20 quid. Now you'd be lucky to get it for less than 100 because it's so in demand.
And demand drives
even
up
for 100
prices,
quid. It's a fantastic piece of kit.
So in terms of that, obviously you looked at putting a game together. Where the hell do you start? Because I think all of us who have sat and ever played a minis game have sat there and made a couple of notes and thought, do you know what? I'd love to do a game about X. There's a piece of local lore from where I am. There's a piece of local history that I've always thought would make an excellent tabletop game. But I wouldn't know where the hell to start. I'm not a games developer. I'm not anything, nothing like that. So where do you start when it starts your mind process and go, right, this is what I want to do?
Short answer is there's no single answer to that question. In terms, because there's two things in miniatures design, and you've got to have them in a miniatures game design, you've got to have them together. And if you don't have one of them, it'll never pan out. So the first is you've got to have a visual inspiration. So it might be a setting, it might be a historical period, it might be a particular range of miniatures, it might be an artist, or it could be a whole range of things. You've got to have that kind of visual inspiration. And before I started work on any of my games, I collated Pinterest boards of inspiration. And if anybody wants to search for Precinct Omega on Pinterest, you'll find my curated boards. So I curated art and I curated miniatures for all of my games that inspired me. And that's sort of where I began, was to get a visual idea of where I wanted the game to be, how I wanted it to look, and how I wanted playing it to feel like to the players. And that was the sort of starting inspiration. You've got to start with that kind of visual inspiration. But the other thing, and lots of people have a visual inspiration. So many people have come to me and said, oh, I got a great idea for a game. This is what it's going to look like. And I go, great. How's it going to work? So you're great to have a visual inspiration, easy. The next bit is the mechanical inspiration, which is, how does it actually work on the tabletop? And when you're looking for mechanical inspiration, that's the challenge. And that's where I push back on a lot of people who come to me with great visual ideas for games. And then I say, yes, but what are the mechanics? How are your mechanics not only going to work, but how are they going to evoke the visual experience that you're talking about? How is that experience of rolling dice and moving lumps of plastic and lead going to give that imaginative feedback into the visual experience you're trying to achieve? And I think where a lot of particularly independent games fail is that they don't connect those two things, that the mechanical experience doesn't feed back to the visual one that the author is trying to evoke. And that's the second hard is the hard bit. I am very, very lucky because I have the Horizon Wars core mechanics. It's a D12 system, as you mentioned. And fundamentally, what you do is you roll D12s and you form them into groups of dice that add up to at least your target number. So if you need 13 and you roll 5 dice, you make groups of those dice that make at least 13. And however many groups you've got, that's how many successes you've got. That's the core Horizon Wars mechanic. And that mechanic is, as far as I can tell so far, unique to Horizon Wars. Now Hard War has it, of course, but Strato licensed that from me, so that's fine. So it's kind of my thing. And I was very, very lucky that I basically came up with those mechanics over the course of about 45 minutes, sitting up in bed with a notebook. And I hit upon it for a number of reasons, but because it fed back into what I was trying to achieve. There was one specific design principle I wanted my game to have that was going to evoke modern battlefield combat, was that there would be no ranges. There would be no absolute range on a weapon. So there's, in 40K, you've got the 24-inch range. If it's at 25 inches, you can't hit it. If it's at 24 inches, you've got a 50-50 chance of hitting it. That always annoyed me. And there are lots of games that do the same thing. It's not just 40K. Yeah. I wanted the idea of range drop-off, that the further away something was, the harder it was to hit, but you always had a chance of hitting it. And so I wrote my original dice mechanics specifically to meet that need. And it was only later, when I was working on Zero Dark, that I realized there were other things to which I could turn the same mechanics. And I could then turn the idea of hits into successes that could then be turned to do other things on the tabletop, like hack a computer or dominate a robot or sneak up on somebody. And we use the same mechanics to do the same thing. So, I was very fortunate that I hit upon those mechanics very quickly. They've been very well received, and I've been able to then build upon those mechanics across several different games. But that's that. If you can find the mechanical underpinning that evokes and feeds back into the visual inspiration, you've got something worth working on.
Yeah.
If you can't link those two up, you're not there yet.
And that's fair. So as we film this, it's the 25th of May. As people hear this, it will be the 2nd of July. So that's just because of how the release schedule works.
Yeah.
And everybody in order. So at this point, Infinite Dark is out and will have been out for 4 and a bit weeks. 28th of May, isn't it dropping? It's dropping
28th of May. It is indeed, yeah. So the PDF version is definitely going to be available in 3 days' time. The print-on-demand hardback might be available. I have my test copy on its way to me, and it should arrive in the next 48 hours. If everything is correct with the test copy, then it will be released on the same day as the PDF. If there are any flaws with it, I've got to go back to the files, fix the flaws, send it back, order a new test copy, which takes 2 or 3 weeks. So it will be a few weeks later.
Yeah.
When I made my very first print book, which was a supplement for Horizon Wars that I independently published, I think I had to get 4 test print copies before it was right, because I was very new to this stuff. And I still have those failed copies sitting on my bookshelf. When I went to Zero Dark, I think I had 2 test copies before I got it right. And Operation Nemesis was right first time. So I'm clearly getting better at this, and my fingers are crossed that Infinite Dark will be right first time.
Yeah.
But we will see.
So in a nutshell, for obviously people that are hopefully now, anybody who's watched this and never heard of your game before and looking to get into it, what are then the differences between the first in the trilogy and now the second coming out? What are the main differences between the two as it comes out?
Well, the main difference is the first one is Special Forces skirmish combat, and the second one is spaceships. So Horizon Wars Infinite Dark is space, and Horizon Wars is one long narrative setting. Zero Dark is set around the middle of that setting. Infinite Dark is towards the end of it. And so humans have left the solar system, they've expanded into space, they've set up this network of jump gates that allows them to move rapidly and reliably between human settled systems. And for reasons that are explained in the book, the jump gate network is starting to fail. And so the various human groups are desperately trying to protect their own jump gates, desperately trying to rediscover lost ones or build new ones to try and maintain the network as it falls apart. And so you take your game into space. What makes, and there are some fantastic spaceship games out there already. Classics like Full Thrust have been out there for a while, and Osprey published A Billion Suns just a couple of months ago. That is a really good looking game. What makes Infinite Dark different, I hope, is 2 things. First of all, you can play it across 3 different scales of play. I call them command levels. So the first one, command level 1, is fighter level dogfighting. So it's your X-Wing type scale game, although it does not work like X-Wing because it's not a World War II fighter game. And level 3 is the classic Battlefleet Gothic battleships, big monsters fighting each other. And level 2 in the middle kind of is the sweet spot between them, which is more about mid-level ships. So if you're thinking ships like a Rosinante from what's it called, the Expanse, or the Nostromo, or the Millennium Falcon, ships that are going to have a small crew but are not mighty battleships. They're explorers, miners, scouts, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's command level 2. So that's the first thing. So generally speaking, whatever collection of spaceships you've already got or you'd like to collect, you'd probably be able to fit them into Infinite Dark. The second thing that I think makes the game unique is that it's not just about the ships, because something you can do is you can add pilots to your ships. These are effectively named characters, and depending on what kind of ship it is, it might be the captain or it might be literally the pilot, but I call them pilots in all cases regardless. And then those pilots will bring their own particular qualities, abilities, and skills to how that ship behaves. And again, like Zero Dark, it's playable solo, co-op, and PvP. And there are rules for your pilots, of course, to evolve and learn and gain experience in the course of a campaign. So your pilots can get better. They may lose their ship and get put into another ship. They might get promoted. They might suffer trauma in the course of a battle of some sort.
Yeah.
All of those things can happen. So you get to tell a story about your pilots as well as the bigger strategic picture of what your fleet is up to.
Sounds awesome. Like I say, you've got the different sizes for people to, like say, if people want to do giant ass battleships going at each other, then that's fine. If people want to do, like you say, more that X-wing, one guy in a thing that's not much bigger than him fighting out, like you said, dog fighting in the sky sort of thing.
It even allows for space-borne mechs as well. So if what you really want is an orbital mecha suit, then Infinite Dark's got you covered.
Well, that's even better. Like, you're covering all the ground. So what are your obviously make a profit is going to be the big one, but what are some of your targets then for the business over the next 12 months? I usually ask people who come on here, what are their hobby targets? Yours are going to be, what are your business targets?
Yeah. My hobby time these days is very much focused on what do I need to get into the photography for the next book.
Yeah.
Because when it comes to playtesting, you don't need painted miniatures to playtest a game. You don't even need miniatures. I could playtest with coins and pieces of cardboard if I had to, and I do. But I do need decent photography, so I tend to be painting up hobby stuff for photographs. And I have an enormous pile of things that are waiting to be painted to appear in various books. But what have I got coming up? So I've got 2 things coming up for Zero Dark in the near future. So I've got, basically the idea is each book will have 3 major supplements. So Zero Dark already has Zero Dark Operation Nemesis. Operation Kurgan, which is the second supplement, will be published round about January, February next year, possibly a little bit later. We'll see how it goes. And then there'll be a third supplement later, probably towards the beginning of 2023. And there'll be 3 supplements as well for Infinite Dark. But I also publish mini supplements to sort of stuff that maybe didn't make it into one of the other books for reasons of space. I've pulled out and parceled up as something else. So I've got 2 mini supplements that are due. So I've just got to replug my computer back in. Hold on. Your viewers didn't see it, but before we started recording, I had to rush around trying to reorganize where my computer was. Right, I've got 2 mini supplements coming out in the next 6 months. One is called Zero Dark Fear. Fear is a rather forced acronym. It's fighting in enclosed areas. And these are rules for, rather than playing Zero Dark on a traditional tabletop, for playing it in corridor spaces. So for people who've already got something like Space Hulk or Imperial Assault or Core Space, any sort of square gridded surface, it's rules for playing Zero Dark in that. It's also going to bring in a new kind of Red Force. So at the moment, the Red Force tends to shoot at you, and they're quite weak and easy to kill. Certainly the basic grunts in the Red Force are easy to kill. In Fear, there'll be a new Red Force called the Brood. And the Brood is a sort of a stand-in for any kind of semi-mindless force. So they might be out-of-control robots, they might be zombies a la Army of the Dead, they might be xenomorphs, if you like that kind of thing, and you've got some aliens hanging around, or gene stealers. So they're still generic, but they don't shoot anymore. What they do is they move quickly and they kill you by eating your face. And because it's fighting in enclosed areas, the distances are much, much smaller and closer than they are in Zero Dark. That game is kind of 90%, or that supplement is kind of 90% written at the moment, but it needs some tweaking. The main problem at the moment is that the Red Force just eat everything. They are very, very fast and very, very deadly. And I want them to be deadly and I want them to be fast, but maybe not that fast. So I'm just tweaking the parameters on that to make it a little bit easier to actually win the missions at the moment, which at the moment are very challenging indeed. So that's coming out over the summer. That will then be followed by Zero Dark Most Wanted, which is another supplement for Zero Dark that introduces named characters. And these are sort of characters from the Fallen Earth, the setting for Zero Dark. But they're not heroes that you add. You still make your own heroes, but they're a mix of Red Force bosses and allies, which is an upgrade you can take for your heroes. And the idea is that each boss will have their own custom mission. And you can add that mission to any campaign that you're playing as like a side mission. And if you succeed in the mission, you recruit the ally. Okay. So you can then add the ally as an upgrade to your team for subsequent missions. And you've defeated a boss. So it's basically a collection of side missions with some extra characters that you can add to your campaigns for Zero Dark. So that's going to be around September, October. Then, as I say, we've got Operation Kurgan. Operation Nemesis focused on Venus and their side in the Fallen Earth. Operation Kurgan will focus on Mars. And it will have a big focus on journalists and spies. So you've already got something called an MJ, an embedded journalist. That's an upgrade, an ally you can take to your team. Operation Kurgan will introduce XJs, the expeditionary journalists. So these are actually heroes who are journalists. So these are sort of lead characters in your team who are also journalists and have access to a variety of journalistic skills. And you also have a hero called a spook in the core rules, who's kind of an attached, a CIA operative or whatever you want to think about them. And Kurgan has a big focus on espionage and journalism, and so it'll just introduce new options for spooks. So rather than the core rules for spooks, you'll have options to take other or additional skills, as well as having a full campaign, 12 missions in a solo or co-op campaign, and then 6 additional PvP missions, all themed around the story of Operation Kurgan, which is lots of good backstabbing, double-crossing stuff. And then, of course, I've got supplements to write for Infinite Dark. I'm not rushing on that one because I want Infinite Dark to get into the market, for people to play it, to get some feedback, find out what people like and don't like. But the plan is that the 3 supplements for Infinite Dark will each focus on a different command level. And they will build upon the story that is told in Infinite Dark. So Infinite Dark the story in Infinite Dark ends on a little bit of a cliffhanger, and then the supplements are going to pick up from that cliffhanger and tell the rest of that story. And the last supplement for Infinite Dark should more or less be the end of the full narrative arc for Horizon Wars, although it will still leave plenty of stuff unsaid because I'm expecting to have second editions in the future where I want to be able to say something new about the setting. And then slightly longer term, beyond the horizon, as it were, we're coming back to the original Horizon Wars with Volume 3 of the trilogy, Horizon Wars Midnight Dark, which is going to be a rewrite of the original Horizon Wars game with all of the learning on how to write and develop games that I've picked up in the years since I wrote Horizon Wars. And my word, there has been a lot to learn along the way. So it will still be built on the same core mechanics, but it will otherwise be a very, very different game to the original Horizon Wars. Same scale, same design objectives, yeah, but a completely new take on the same thing.
Sounds like you've been a busy boy and you're going to be an even busier boy as time goes forward.
Yeah, well, got to put food on the table.
Of course. And the harder you work, the more likely that happens, right? So there you go. So for those people who are watching this and don't necessarily know where to find all the best of you and all of the games you're putting out and you have got out, reel them off. Where are the best places to find you and all of your stuff and everything to do with Horizon Wars?
Easiest, quickest way to find any of the publications is to go to wargamevault.com and search for Precinct Omega, and you'll get my publisher page on there that's got all the PDFs, and any print on demands that are available are on there with all the latest discounts and anything that's on. If you want to sort of see more widely what Precinct Omega is doing, can you hear the knocking in the background? I'm sorry, my dog is scratching at the door.
That's absolutely fine. Mine's sleeping next door, and luckily she's been asleep. So,
but if you want to see more widely what Precinct Omega is up to, you can also go to precinctomega.co.uk. There are links there to the Wargame Vault site, so you can go straight to the games from there. Or you can also see my blog that's got design notes on the various games that I've written, reviews, industry insights. It does also have miniatures to buy, because I do actually stock miniatures of various sorts. I'm desperate to sell them, frankly, because I need to get them off my hands. So please take miniatures from me. And if you're interested in really seeing behind the scenes, there are two things you can do. The first and easiest is to listen to my podcast every week at precinctomega.podbean.com. But the most constructive is to go to patreon.com/precinctomega and become a patron, because my patrons get insight into all the behind the scenes stuff, the triumphs, the failures, full exposure to my declining mental health as I go through any development process, and all of the sort of the beta material and test stuff goes through my patrons. So if you want to see what's coming in the future, it's the place you want to be.
I'll put as many of those links as can fit in the little section underneath your name, just so obviously people can obviously see it. So all that's left for me to do is to obviously thank you for coming on and sharing this with us. I'm going off now to read those books that you sent me in a lot more detail, because you have piqued my interest, sir. So I may come along and buy some of those miniatures you're desperate to get rid of.
Fantastic.
But yeah, so thank you very much for joining us. Well done on getting 1 minute 15. It's a quick time. And
I'll have to do better next time.
Well, I'm trying to come up with a new challenge, but I don't know what it is yet. So I'll once I've figured that out, we'll get you back, and hopefully we can get you get updates on where you're up to with Horizon Wars.